The phone buzzed at 6:02 a.m., small, insistent, the kind of sound that announces either a boarded flight or someone's life about to derail. I was still half in the dream where I had missed a train and was trying to make it to a meeting that didn't exist. The city outside my window was a blurry smear of sodium light and rain. I thumbed the screen open and listened. "Dana," Preston said. His voice was exactly what it had been for 3 years, rehearsed warmth with the edges sanded off. "We've made some decisions. We're letting you go. You've been difficult to manage." They always go straight for the performance metric that sounds like a flaw but reads like a compliment. Difficult to manage, too independent, too loud around the wrong people. The corporate euphemism for "you're good enough to matter, you're too much for the family." I didn't raise my voice. There was no point. I finished my coffee. I set the mug down in the sink because habits are stabilizers. The room smelled faintly of French roast and wet concrete. Rain was a convenient punctuation mark for a morning that had just tilted. "You have an hour," Preston continued, "to wrap up. Security will handle access after that. HR will process your offboarding. Gerald will reach out about paperwork." He sounded like a man reciting a script he'd never had to own. He didn't ask if I needed to speak to someone. He didn't pause to listen for the weight of his words. It was efficient, the way an imperative should be. It was sloppy, too. The sloppy arrogance of someone who thinks he can remove the inconvenient parts of a machine and not expect the machine to splutter. "You're making a mistake," I said, because it was the shape of the conversation I was trained to have, or maybe because I wanted him to feel the texture of the dismissal, to register that it landed. "There are live negotiations. There are relationships in motion. You understand how much of the client book I manage." "I'm sure HR can explain the transition," he said. "Well, make it clean." That was the key word, clean. Make it neat so no one asks questions. Make the narrative tidy so oxygen can't feed the flames. That had always been their instinct, to edit the story rather than fix the plot. When the call ended, I closed my eyes and let myself imagine the worst for a heartbeat. Preston smiling in the boardroom, Richard, his father and the CEO, giving him a pat on the back for righting the ship. They would sleep on the story and feel righteous. They would tell themselves a story about discipline. They would tell the board a different story in which staffing optimization was a virtue. But I also knew something they did not. Optima was not just a corporate shell with quarterly slides. Its nervous system, the relationships with investors, clients, and influencers, ran in large part through me. They could remove my title, my badge, my calendar privileges, but they could not, in a meaningful way, erase the trust I'd built with a handful of people who moved real money and had the power to move markets if they wished. I could have been furious. I could have broken things. I could have spent an hour composing a tantrum email to the board that would have felt cathartic and done nothing. Instead, I did 2 things that feel very much like me. I set a few rules, and then I followed them. Rule 1, no theatrics. If you want to win in a boardroom or on the market, you don't perform for the cameras, you manage optics. Optima wanted a clean narrative. I would give them a cleaner one, but one that belonged to me. Rule 2, don't be stupid. There's a certain kind of revenge that reads well in movies, glamorous, messy, technically creative. It's also often illegal. I have never been interested in that. I was raised to win within systems and to weaponize other people's ignorance, not to break the things that protect them. I would not delete files. I would not exfiltrate data. I knew the limits of my options and where the law's shadow would land. That moral and legal boundary made the axe I chose sharper by contrast. Rule 3, leverage relationships, not systems. If you understand the way trust migrates in financial ecosystems, you know where to press. You don't have to touch servers to move money. You only have to present a more stable-looking shore to which people can tie their boats. I sat down at my desk in the room focused. The rain on the window became a soft metronome. My laptop screen glowed, already logged in. There was a narrow window before access would be cut. An hour, maybe less. Those were not instructions. They were constraints that framed choices. In that hour, I moved with a deliberate kind of economy. I archived messages that mattered, not to hide evidence that would have been both meaningless and risky, but to preserve context. I copied contract language that looked incomplete on Optimus Portal into a personal folder I had legitimately maintained for client work. I made sure no alarms were tripped. Mostly, I made mental notes: who to call, what to say, how to make each conversation subtly alter the public perception of a mid-sized tech consultancy that had just fired its most visible rainmaker. I didn't take anything that didn't belong to me. The distinction mattered. This was not a heist. It was leverage. By 7:15, Preston had already moved on. He forwarded a terse note to the board announcing the adjustment. The language was precise and intentionally antiseptic. Someone on the board would smile and think of efficiency. I posted a message to my immediate team, the people whose morning would be shattered by the vacuum. I told them I was stepping back and thanked them for everything. I flagged Chloe, the junior analyst, who had been with me for 18 months and had learned how to make difficult PowerPoints look like poetry. Chloe would be collateral in this. That thought left a taste in my mouth for which later I would try to pay. She texted within the hour, because she always did. What happened? Did they give you a reason? Her text had those 3 little digital patient commas that means someone is waiting to be told what to be worried about. Long story. Keep your head down. I'll check in, I typed back. It wasn't avoidance, it was triage. Panic spreads faster than reason in a hallway. My job was to prevent the contagion. After the first wave of quiet calls, I made the call I'd been saving, Marcus Thorne. Marcus was regional director at Apex Capital, a competitor in the small ecosystem of funds that orbit companies like Optima. He knew how to read a balance sheet and how to read a person. He also liked decisive people, and in the industry, decisiveness smells like competence. Morning, he said. He was late for the day, his voice the gravelly smoothness of someone who'd been smoking for 20 years and yet had never applied for a bank loan. Marcus, I said, I have 30 minutes. His laugh sounded like he approved of the framing. You're never concise. What's up? They fired me, I said, and let the words sit between us like a fact. He didn't ask for details. He was too old for theatrics. Texted 3 runbooks and told me to make it clean. I'm in the middle of client handovers and a board process. I can be at Apex by noon if you want me. There was a pause. In that pause, I could hear the calculation. Moves cascade in minutes. Endorsements, offers, the lightly veiled panic of investors who have spent decades chasing yield and can't tolerate organizational risk. We'll make room, Marcus said. You want the seat? You'll need to move fast. There are 3 clients on the fence. Arthur Sterling is meeting me for lunch in an hour. I watched the minute hand on the wall. Breakfast had congealed into strategy. If Apex signals that they can house them, that will be enough. Arthur, the old man with the sailor jacket? Marcus asked. Even his voice had a smile. That's quite a lunch to have. He's not all old jackets and charm. He's the one who decides whether we get to play in that part of the pool next quarter. If he walks, Optimus runway drops by tens of millions. I did not quantify. I didn't need to. Marcus could do the math for himself. I'll write you an offer, he said, quick and clean. We'll do the recruiting paperwork and put a transition package on top. You won't have to wait for HR to warm their chairs. There is a kind of intimacy in a quick offer. It's not trust exactly. It's a recognition that the person making it understands what doors opening look like and can create one. Marcus understood. He made the box look like something I would willingly step into. I accepted. Within 30 minutes, I had a terse email from Apex's talent team with an outline and a confirmation from Marcus that they would take the 3 clients I mentioned, provided I could meet them and secure their buy-in. It was not a promise of money, it was a promise of stability, and in markets where people live on relationships, stability is currency. With an offer accepted, I did the only other thing you do when you shift the narrative of a person's professional identity. I posted. There are people who think social posts are silly. I've seen brilliant corporate travelers watch as a poorly timed post collapses a day's work. But a post, when executed with restraint and clarity, is a public signal. It is a way of telling the market which narrative you want to stick. I wrote a short update, nothing dramatic, no accusations, no exclamation points, and announced my move to Apex, framed as an opportunity to serve clients better. I thanked the colleagues who had taught me things and left the post open for messages. I do not overinflate these performative spaces, but the reality is this. LinkedIn is an echo chamber where perception amplifies. A considered post with a tasteful headshot and a precise line about new beginnings will land differently than a rumor. It creates a public fact that is hard for legal teams to immediately erase without looking petty. Within 20 minutes, messages started to trickle in. Small at first, congratulations from former colleagues, a cautious good luck from an industry contact I'd once saved from a hairy deal. Then 2 DMs that mattered, one from a partner at a major investor group and another from a mid-level associate at Sterling's office. The partner's message was careful not to promise anything. The associate's was blunt. We need to talk. Arthur wants to meet you. The universe, I thought, is often not cruel, it's indifferent. Yet indifference can be coaxed into cooperation if the rhythms of trust line up. I met Arthur Sterling at a club that feels like it prefers to hide its affluence. He was shorter than I expected, with a face that had not learned to age politely. He wore a tweed jacket and a sailor's cap that made him look like a retired commodore who had missed the sea. His hands were rough, and they smelled faintly of cigar smoke. Old money with new teeth. He shook my hand like a man who has lived in the company of executive levels and wants to know who is honest and important in environments. You look calm, he said. Honesty as an opener. Very old school. I've been fired before breakfast. It gives you perspective on your to-do list, I replied. Small talk, then a move into the important friction of the table. He was direct, the way older investors are. They have seen the cycles. They speak in terms of custody and certainty because they understand the cumulative effect of small betrayals over decades.
Optima told us an internal reorganization. We got calls.
He folded his napkin and looked at me the way one inspects a fine grain of wood for knots. Your name came up in 2 separate investor conversations this morning. That's unusual. It's usually me on the calls, I said. I keep most relationships. They're not a spreadsheet for them. They're people who have decisions to make about where to put trust. He nodded. If I shift my allocation away from Optima, others will follow. They watch you. They ask if the group is stable. They ask whether management can manage. Richard has charm, but charm does not move money. Competence does. This was the precise language I had rehearsed in the shower for nights. Competence, not charisma. Investors translate that into cash quickly. Why me? Arthur asked suddenly. Why would you risk burning bridges? I didn't burn them, I said. I preserved them. The sentence landed like a soft tool. I told a few clients I was moving. They had time to think. They contacted their advisors. They decided. Arthur smiled at that. It wasn't the smile of a man softened by sentiment. It was the smile of someone whom you had explained risk to in terms he could respect. We talked about the mechanics superficially. Transitions, continuity, the ways in which client relationships survive or die through trust and person-to-person reassurance. I kept my language cautious, deliberately bland on procedure, but precise in outcome. I emphasized what clients gain by moving to a more stable steward. I emphasized that Apex could house the accounts without interruption. I emphasized, without ever saying it directly, that Optima had allowed instability to fester. Skepticism, he said, is my default. But I'm old enough to notice when the default is wrong. This wasn't flattery. It was a summary of decision-making. You're good at the hard part, making people feel safe enough to give you their money. Convince me you can keep that feeling, and I'll move funds. There are conversations where numbers are present but not named, where the magnitude is felt rather than recited. He did not say 80 million. He did not need to. The figure lived in both of us as an absent weight. We discussed the terms in principle, a phased transfer with commitments to continuity and a short transition period. He asked the obvious questions about custody and counterparty risk. I supplied obvious answers, the kind that align with common sense diligence without venturing into technical instruction. At one point, Arthur leaned back and made a small, nearly invisible gesture with his thumb. You understand the optics, he said. This needs to look like a vote of confidence, not a panic. That line was crucial. If the move looked desperate, it would be read as a sell signal. If it looked deliberate, it would be read as a strategic redeployment. The difference between panic and purpose is often a haircut and a statement. I ensured my posture matched purpose. He asked one final question. Why do you think they fired you? I could have given the truth. Nepotism, Preston's need to consolidate power, Richard's choice to hedge the family name against someone who made them look inadequate. Instead, I took the narrative he wanted and twisted it toward the useful. They were threatened by influence that wasn't coaxed by titles, I said. They didn't want someone who could run without them. He chuckled softly. So you were a problem? Yes, I said. I was problematic. It was delicious, the way a word can be reclaimed. They had labeled me with a badge meant to shame. I wore it like a new coat. When we left the room, Arthur gave me a curt, businesslike handshake and a promise in the form investors give, a conditional commitment. He'd move if he felt the arrangement was bulletproof. He did not say, you won me. He never would, not in public. He also did not walk away. The rest of the morning unfolded like the calibration of a well-oiled instrument. DMs multiplied into emails. Clients called with the tones of people deciding which shore to anchor against a storm. The market, as markets do, picks up signals and turns them into noise and then into meaning. A single LinkedIn post becomes a rumor, becomes a headline, becomes a fund manager's justification for action. I wasn't naive enough to expect all of them to come to me, or even most, just enough. And then the calls began from Optima's side. Gerald, the general counsel, started with thin politeness and moved quickly to pointedness. Gaina, he said, we need to speak about your LinkedIn post and your client outreach. We can, I murmured, but I'm no longer at Optima. My obligations are limited to the signed agreements. His voice hardened. We are reviewing to ensure there was no misappropriation of data or client poaching. Legal threat is a performance often used to create the aura of introl. It's a bluff wrapped in a paper trail. The claim was familiar, the insinuation that I had crossed lines I hadn't. Their stance was aggressive and predictable, the kind of reheated threaten and pivot routine boardrooms deploy when they realize music is starting to play they can't dance to. We'll cooperate with counsel, I said. We want this to be resolved without theater. That last word, theater, was a soft barbed wire. Optima wanted the narrative to be about my wrongdoing. If the story became about their governance failures, missing handshakes, unsigned succession plans, absent approvals, then their legal posture looked like a cover. The difference matters.
They began to issue the right noises. HR sent templated messages. Security sent a terse email confirming access revocation. Preston posted his small public statement on the company internet about strategic realignment. Each of those acts was a move to draw a neat line under the story, but public statements don't retract trust. They punctuate timelines.
I spent that afternoon balancing conversations. Sarah, the counsel at Apex, was pragmatic and patient. She coordinated with Marcus and mapped the legal terrain in a way that kept our exposure minimal and our messaging consistent. We would not litigate, we would outposition. Legal teams are good at making problems look like paperwork. I preferred to make them look like an outcome investors could buy into. There was, of course, collateral damage. Chloe's world tilted. She called once more, voice thinner now. She'd already been fielding angry emails from a client who had been left on a Wednesday with a proposed timeline and no steward. They said they'd reassign, she whispered, but nothing is set. I closed my laptop and walked down the block to the little coffee shop where she worked afternoons. She arrived 20 minutes later, eyes rimmed with corporate exhaustion and the kind of fear you get when your safety net is someone else's whim. You don't have to be quiet, I said, pulling a chair close. I can introduce you to Marcus. Apex is hiring analysts. They need people who know how things are actually done. She looked at me like I was offering a rope. Would you really do that? I would, I said. You don't owe loyalty to people who treat you as expendable. That empathy is important to me because it stops the buildup from turning into a performance of cruelty. I am not indifferent to the humans who are swept in a tide of corporate repositioning. I also knew that if I could offer Chloe a way forward, I owed her that small act of repair. By late afternoon, the rumor mill had started to resolve into a pattern. A handful of clients were open to the idea of moving. A few were skeptical. Most were nervous. The board, sensing an incoming gust of something it could not yet name, began to make small defensive motions. Excessive legal posturing, oddly, often signals insecurity. Anyone who's watched this dance long enough learns to read the small cues. The hurriedly scheduled board call, the memo about stability, the tone of press releases. You could see the outline of panic many chairs away before anyone announced that they were nervous. That evening, Preston sent me an email, copied to HR and the board. It was the kind of document that is half warning and half self-praise. He accused me of aggressive network maneuvers and suggested we were in breach of multiple policies. There were phrases like potential misappropriation and intent to destabilize. The wording was careful. It was also desperate. Desperation reads as moral fury, but often hides an inability to manage a problem. I responded with professional brevity. I pointed out the signed agreements that bound me and the ways in which the company's own files showed gaps in approvals. That last detail would matter later. It was not accusation so much as a precise observation. They had missed their paperwork. You can threaten litigation until your voice is hoarse, but you cannot use a lawsuit to cover an absent signature. That night, the market did a thing that markets do when they smell an unsteady structure. Small repricings. Nothing dramatic, yet, but enough to cause a faint ripple. I watched the tickers and felt something oddly akin to a stab of pride. It's a strange sensation to feel satisfaction at seeing years of relationship work translate into measurable risk for an incumbent you suspect is incompetent and nepotistic. It is also tinged with something else, guilt, for the people who might lose jobs as a result. Before bed, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list, not of vindictive moves, but of contingencies and humane acts. Check on Chloe, reach out to the IT lead who'd been loyal and overworked, connect a few junior staff with recruiters who valued their skills. You can make a mess and walk away. You can also try to put a little kindness where it's needed. I slept badly and woke earlier than necessary. The day of the quarterly results call was less a date than a slowly approaching crescendo. That call is where narratives either gel or dissolve. You can stand in front of investors and give crisp figures and confident rhetoric, but if your foundation is made of shaky stories, the slide deck is a stage curtain, thin and easily torn. I went in early and sat in my car outside the office. The city was waking up, buses swallowing blocks and spitting out commuters. I thought about Richard, the CEO. He had been good to the company in earlier era, before the board's appetites changed and before the sun found his way into the inner circle. Richard had become, in many ways, a symbol of the company's charm. Charm carries well in hallways and with journalists. It does not carry cash to the balance sheet when clients feel exposed. At 9:30 sharp, I walked into a room that smelled of late coffee and the low electrical hum of corporate heating. The boardroom was glass and too bright. Preston sat at one end, his jaw set with resignation that wanted to look triumphant. Richard arrived with a practiced smile, as if the day were simply another meeting to be nudged. I took my seat and observed. Attention matters. How people hold themselves reveals the stories they tell. The quarterly call had the usual structure, the CFO delivering numbers, slides about growth, Q&A. There were thin smiles and practiced confidence. Investors phoned in, their voices clipped. For a while, it looked like any other call in corporate history. Then Arthur's name came up on the list of attendees. The sound of his voice was the kind of presence that makes a room listen, not loud, but with the weight of someone accustomed to being heard.
When he asked his first question, it was not about revenue projections or product timelines. It was a simple thing. How will Optima ensure continuity for our allocations in the next quarter if senior staff are being reorganized?
That is how you puncture a narrative. You are not discussing the board's feelings. You are bringing the conversation back to trust. When you ask about continuity, you make the board answer with something more than platitudes. Preston tried to answer. His phrasing was defensive and technical, the language of someone who recites processes instead of describing people. Richard rustled his papers and attempted to add color. Both answers landed as if on distant islands, factual but not calming. The phone lines hummed with silence while investors recalculated. In the minutes that followed, the call disintegrated into something else, a public negotiation of confidence. Questions became sharper. The CFO sounded like someone reading from a script that had been written in a vacuum. The board, sensing the loss of control, began to rustle. The market, always hungry for a reason to adjust, did what markets do. I sat still and watched. There was no gloating in my face. I had never been the kind of person to crow over a colleague's humiliation. What I felt was a kind of clinical satisfaction. A pattern had been exposed. Governance gaps, leadership hesitation, and the economic reality that when trust migrates, capital follows. When the call ended, the room felt colder. Richard's smile had fissures. Preston's jaw had dropped into a new line of worry. There were no immediate resignations, no hand-wringing grand gestures. Instead, there were emails and callbacks and the quiet, ugly work of damage control. Outside the glass wall, the city carried on, indifferent. Inside, men and women in expensive suits tried to find a narrative that would make sense of a morning that had contradicted their carefully curated stories. I left the building before the formal communiques were drafted. There is a modest dignity in departing while the scene is still playing out. It preserves your silence as something other people will fill with noise. I had done what I needed to do to preserve relationships and to place the company's instability into the light. I had not maliciously attacked anyone. I had not broken a law. I had played by the rules of optics, timing, and trust. On the subway home, my phone buzzed with messages. Marcus sent a single line. Sterling moved. CFO called in panic. Good work. Others pinged with similar, shorter confirmations. Seeing outflows. Board called emergency meeting. It's not pleasant to watch a system you once cared about wobble. It's not pleasant to see inboxes of people who once relied on you light up with questions and hurt. But it is sometimes necessary. That night I sat across from Arthur again, and the weight of the conversation pressed different. He spoke in measured sentences about fiduciary duty and reputational risk. He asked about transition teams and the assurances I could provide. I answered them with the same restraint I had maintained throughout the day. He signed an email confirming his intent to reallocate a tranche to Apex pending formal paperwork. The transaction was not public then, but the effect was already in motion. In the hours after the email, I received a private message from Chloe. I applied at Apex. Thank you. It was a small victory in an ugly morning. I also received an email from Optima's counsel, short, crystalline, and thin with threat. They alleged improprieties and demanded certain documents be turned over. They suggested potential litigation. I forwarded the message to Sarah and Marcus and reminded myself that legal theater is often a tactic to stall and create moral panic among investors. I had not trespassed. I had made a better shore look safer. The law in this case was their chosen weapon, but it was a blunt one. Sometime after midnight, I walked the block near my apartment and watched the city breathe. The lights in high towers blinked like a constellation that had learned to be indifferent to human vanity. I thought about the people swept into the day's turbulence. Chloe, the overworked IT lead, the junior associates who now faced ambiguous futures. I thought about Richard, pacing his floors, trying to make sense of a morning when applause turned to questions. I did not sleep until I had written a note to the people who mattered to me, not for leverage, but for closure. To Chloe, keep the faith, here's a contact. To the IT lead, if you need references, call me. To Arthur, thank you for the trust. To Marcus, let's be careful with optics. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the story I had nudged into motion had picked up momentum. A rumor here, an investor reallocation there. The company's board was convening an emergency session. Gerald's earlier threats had hardened into a public posture. Preston and Richard were beginning to understand that firing one person had not erased the risks, it had transformed them into a shared corporate reality. I sat in my new office at Apex for the first time, a modest desk with a perfect city view, and felt the odd mixture of vindication and unease. There is satisfaction in watching competence displace nepotism, in seeing trust restored where it had been endangered. There is also an ache for the human cost of public falls, people's livelihoods, reputations, and the messy, intimate consequences of corporate warfare. I made a small list of things to do. Check in on the team from Optima and Rescued, confirm the transition plan for Sterling's allocations,
Prepare for the next public call where Optima would have to answer investor questions with fewer options than they'd presumed. And I thought, they called me problematic. In their world, the label was meant to discredit. In mine, it was a compliment disguised as an insult, an admission that I refused to be a footnote in someone else's story. There is a lesson here about power and the way it moves. You don't always need to be loud to be effective.
You need to be correct at the moment that matters. You need to be trusted, and you need to ensure others perceive that trust. The rest is choreography. The horizon was already littered with motions, an emergency board packet, Preston's increasingly unsteady statements, an investor's carefully worded letter. The narrative had changed, and no amount of spin could stitch it back to the same cloth. I had done what I set out to do. I preserved relationships, I signaled stability to those who mattered, and I let the market do what markets do. In doing so, I precipitated a crisis of confidence at Optima that originated in poor governance and was amplified by hubris. That, at least, was the comfortable truth, I told myself. And yet, even satisfied, I knew the worst was not behind me. Legal teams would make noise. Boardrooms would attempt to regain footing. There would be more calls, more questions. The public Q3 call loomed like a crucible I had not yet chosen to step into. The real test, the point at which the house's health would be publicly judged, had not yet happened. I closed my laptop and looked out over the city. The rain had stopped. The streets were steaming in the weak autumn sun. Somewhere, in a conference room I no longer occupied, someone was drafting a defense. Somewhere else, people were packing their desks or updating resumes. The story was not finished. I took a breath, unlocked my phone, and began to type a message to Marcus. Prepare for the call. They'll try to control the narrative. We need to be ready to show certainty. I pressed send, and for a moment the world contracted to a single line of pixels conveying intent. Outside, the city continued to move, indifferent yet responsive to the small ripples we made. Inside, the players shifted. They had labeled me problematic. They had not expected that label to be an asset. That oversight would be costly for them. The next move would be public, messy, and definitive. I walked to the window and watched the light climb the glass towers, imagining how it would catch in the boardroom when the call broke and the questions came. The stakes had moved beyond my personal position to something larger, a test of governance, a reckoning of competence, and the redistribution of trust. I had set the stage. Now I waited to see who would walk into the spotlight and how brightly they could pretend to hold it. The call started like any other, a thin-voiced moderator, the CFO's practiced cadence, the slide deck's gentle insistence that everything was fine. For 20 minutes it read like a rehearsal of competence. Okay numbers here, cautious optimism there, a slide about strategic realignment that felt like balm. The audio grid hummed with distant coughs and keystrokes. I watched it unfold with the same professional curiosity I'd bring to a hard negotiation, calmly, cataloging inflection, tone, and the small tells that reveal more than content. Then Arthur spoke again, and the room shifted. "Can you walk us through client continuity?" he asked, not in the curious tone of a casual investor, but as someone doing due diligence with the patience of a man who has watched firms dissolve on slower, subtler betrayals. The question landed as a pivot, a hinge on which the company's narrative could tilt toward steadiness or unravel into mismanagement. Preston rose to the occasion the way someone who reads from a script rises. His sentences were clean, his words chosen for cadence, not for sincerity. Richard interjected with a smile meant to cloak worry with charm. For a few breaths, it almost held. Then an analyst from a mid-sized fund asked a pointed follow-up. Were any client allocations under active review this quarter? Had there been unusual outbound inquiries since the reorganization? No one could answer with reassuring specificity. The CFO, suddenly stranded between prepared slides and raw investor curiosity, offered a hedged statistic and an optimistic timeline. Optimism is a fine thing when it's credible. It's brittle when it's not. Voices began to thicken in the line. Question became push. Call participants stopped being polite and started being literal. Which clients have been approached? Which allocations are at risk? The interrogative rhythm accelerated. Investors had a way of asking the exact question that revealed a rumor's shape, and once a rumor found its shape, markets respond. I did not speak. I watched. There is a certain mastery in sitting still while others stumble. My silence was not aloofness, it was strategy, allowing their words to fill the frame, so that when the recorded narrative was played back, the inconsistencies would be audible to everyone on the line. Then, procedurally, someone on Optima's side read out a prepared statement about governance, about internal review, and a renewed focus on client stewardship.
It sounded like an urgent memo performed as theater. The boardroom assembled around the call looked like a courtroom of the insecure, parading legalisms as armor. I felt a prickle of pity for Richard there, a man who once read company dinners like scripture, now reduced to reading a press release somebody else had written. Pride had buffered him for years. The market doesn't pay in pride. Minutes later, a voice I recognized as a portfolio manager from a small international fund, a fund that historically followed Arthur's cues, said, "We need to put our allocations in a holding pattern. We can't underwrite talent risk right now." It was the linguistic equivalent of a shutter being pulled across a window. You do not say holding pattern unless you intend to move capital away if confidence is not restored. You could feel, even through a network call, the collective physiological response of a financial audience. Inhalation, calculation, and the tacit permission to reallocate. The room's corporate atmosphere thinned into something raw.
Questions started to combine evidence and consequence. What controls ensure client communications were handled appropriately? Do you have a list of contacts and confirmations post-reorg? The more they asked, the less confident the answer sounded. From the outside, this is one of those moments where small things, a missing signature, an unclear chain of custody for a client note, balloon into existential questions. Optima's internal gaps were not dramatic on their own, but in a live, recorded environment, they multiplied. Investors prefer to commit to narratives that are coherent, and Optimus had been edited in ways that valued optics over robustness. That editing cost them credibility. Mid-call, the operator announced a private question coming from Arthur. The line went quiet in a way that silence traditionally does in rooms built around voice. Expectant, charged. Arthur asked about Optima's contingency planning for client transitions, and whether they had formal counterparty arrangements that would ensure no disruption. The CFO's answer came as a collage of assurances. I could see the micro-movements in the room, a hand to a mouth, a halfway smile, the practiced attempt to translate worry into a plan. When Richard spoke, attempting to add strategic reassurance, his sentences were not joined. It was like watching a seamstress stitch a seam that keeps pulling apart. In a recording, those gaps read as gaps in governance. The board members' faces tightened in real time. One investor asked for concrete names of who would lead client transitions. That's where the screw turned. Optimus' answer referenced internal teams and reassignment, but when the CEO was pressed for names, specific leaders who would be the point of continuity for large allocations, the only named people were junior managers whose control over primary relationships was minimal. The obvious follow-up, where are the custodial agreements, where are the documented client confirmations, hung like a red flag in the call. This is when the dust starts to settle into measurable movement. Employees on the ground sense it first, an intern's DM about an excited message from a client, the finance team's spreadsheets the line that went cold. Then portfolio managers who are paid to react begin to call with just to confirm questions. Small inquiries become justification for repositioning. The logic of capital is relentless. It rewards perceived stability and punishes ambiguity. I watched as the tide turned. It never feels dramatic on screen the way fiction would like. It is procedural, almost clerical. An investor who had been quiet the whole call says, "We're reevaluating." Another adds, "Will reduce exposure pending written assurances." A chorus forms. The moderator politely closes the Q&A and promises a follow-up, but the follow-up was now the story, an admission that the call had not closed the gap investors had opened. After it ended, the boardroom emptied into private corners and tightly worded emails. Optima's public-facing glass did not shatter, but its cracks were now visible. The phone lines lit up, not with congratulatory notes, but with the urgent, terse language of emergency lifeboat maneuvers. "We need to convene. We need an investor briefing. Prepare a memo." Outside, in feeds and private channels, the effect was an accelerant. Marcus texted, "Market moved. We're seeing traction." 3 investors had already drafted conditional reallocations to Apex, pending paperwork. Arthur had moved enough of his allocation to create a momentum shift. It's funny and grim how money is both abstract and remarkably physical. A signature in an email, a conditional commitment, and millions of dollars find new custodians. Within 24 hours, the board had convened an emergency session. Emails leaked, not illegal leaks, but the kind of associative communications that travel in corporate ecosystems like a scent. Firm statements, HR briefings, legal memos. Gerald had shifted tone from threatening to conciliatory. When someone's legal posture becomes conciliatory in public correspondence, it's often because the public question is scary enough that defense looks like a losing motion. There are a few moments in corporate life where the choreography is so mechanical it feels almost theatrical. The board met, called advisors, and discussed reputational damage controls. They debated the optics of a public apology, the risk of counterclaims, and the messaging that would placate investors without admitting governance fissures. Underneath all of that, they were quite simply asking themselves whether the company's leadership could inspire confidence again.
Richard's public persona had been a kind of soft charisma for a long time. Charm had carried him through earlier seasons. But charm is not a substitute for the precise, boring, granular things investors need to see. Signed agreements, named custodians, explicit continuity plans. The board's emergency packets, the documents compiled in a flurry of midnight emails, revealed in small ways the cracks I had noticed during my hour of access. Unsigned amendments, ambiguous ownership of client documents, and a lack of documented contingency plans. No single missing paper is a death knell. A pattern of omission is. Preston, who had authorized my dismissal with the neatness he thought was decisive, now became the human symbol of a policy gone wrong. He tried to defend the company's actions in a press statement full of buzzwords and blandness. But investors are not swayed by word salads when their capital is on the line. They are swayed by assurance. That assurance requires named people with clear responsibilities. Preston's language did not produce names. It produced more verbs. By the third day, the board had a choice. They could double down, defend a reorganization, ostracize dissent, and hope the market forgot.
Or they could cut a leadership line where responsibility would be visible and signal a reset. Boards are conservative. They hate admission. But they also hate market instability, because that translates into risk on their watch. Richard called a special session, and in a meeting that was part resignation and part negotiated settlement, agreed to step down. It was not a melodramatic scene. There were no fistfights, no last-minute pleas. It was a quiet sequence of legal formalities and carefully worded releases. The board announced an amicable leadership transition and appointed an interim CEO with immediate effect. There are months and years when a public statement reads as a funeral notice for a prior era. This one did. Preston was reassigned to an advisory role with a generous severance. That phrasing, reassigned, is corporate for "we will move you off stage and into a room where you cannot damage the narrative further." He complained in private emails that it was unjust. The board, no doubt anxious about optics, preferred to avoid a messy public firing. Management transitions that include severance are a tidy way to align legal risk with reputational repair. You could call it triumph. You could also call it the market doing what it always does, reallocating capital to points of perceived competence. I prefer a less celebratory word, consequence. The company's leadership choices had consequences. My being labeled problematic was their shorthand for disciplining a person whose competence made them uncomfortable. When competence costs the firm money, competence becomes the victim of its own value. I felt a mixture of relief and tremor. Watching a company reorient is not cathartic in the way a storybook revenge is. It's a sequence of human costs and administrative realities. There were people left in the wake who would bear the brunt of investor movements. Chloe emailed me a snapshot of her new offer letter, small in salary terms, but enormous in security. She sounded, in the text, exhausted and averse to drama. "Thank you," she wrote simply. That was the currency that mattered most to me. A single person kept afloat. The IT lead, a quiet, efficient woman named Mara who used to clock in hours fixing things that should have been fixed by design, texted a single line. "If you can, please list me as a reference." I wrote a carefully composed note on company letterhead the next day. It felt modest and consequential. People like Mara are the infrastructure of companies. They are often overlooked until the day devices stop connecting and email threads go cold. Helping them was not penance. It was an obligation I felt acutely. A week later, filings hit the newswires. Not scandalous. Nothing criminal had happened. But they were investor letters, carefully framed, that described a board's loss of confidence in headline terms. The stock, illiquid but public enough to register movement, dipped. Headlines used language like leadership shakeup and governance questions. The narrative had changed. That is all markets need sometimes, a new narrative to justify capital movement. Optima scrambled to shore up its messaging. They hired a communications shop, shortened messages, and promised an external audit. But those are medium-term band-aids. The immediate effect, the exit of some key allocations to Apex and others, had real consequences for their runway. Investors do not reward flimsiness. Meanwhile, at Apex, clients transitioned. The 3 major accounts I'd steered arrived with a mixture of gratitude and guardedness. They wanted continuity more than rhetoric. My role was to be a line of trust, not a celebrity. We staffed up a transition team, not in order to gloat, but to ensure funds were moved cleanly and clients experienced no lapses. That, ultimately, is what mattered to the people who give money to managers, the steady, frictionless administration of their allocations. People like Arthur are not theatrical about their power. He performed no grand gesture. He signed an email. He moved amounts that, when aggregated with other investors' choices, have the arithmetic force to reshape a mid-sized firm's prospects. The $80 million line, a figure that hung in the background of our conversations like an implied weight, was the sum of commitments and shifts. Saying it aloud is less triumphant than clinical. Money moved because trust migrated. That is the mechanics of this world. Optima's legal team continued to posture. There were letters, demands, and the inevitable threat of litigation for misappropriation.
These are common moves when a company senses reputational loss. Threat becomes a pressure valve. We responded with counsel that was calm and precise. We produced documentation that showed no evidence of wrongdoing and highlighted the gaps in Optima's record-keeping. That detail mattered. It converted a browbeating narrative into a factual one. Law, in these cases, is often less about right or wrong and more about the documentary record. People like Preston tried to make the moral equation a simple accusation that an employee had orchestrated destabilization. It's a tidy narrative. Villainize the inconvenienced person and hope the market forgets. But markets and institutional investors operate on evidence and continuity. When the evidence suggested governance failures rather than malicious intent, the accusation lost traction. There is a kind of normative hygiene in this. You can thrash a narrative full of venom, but if it lacks support, it will not hold in public markets. Even as Optima's leadership shuffled, the human cost continued. Mid-level employees who had no stake in senior power plays found themselves in the wreckage. I called a few, not because I needed PR points, but because I owed them. A promise of references, introductions to recruiters, a note that could tilt an email thread in a hiring manager's favor.
These small acts do not undo corporate damage, but they stitch things for individuals who will carry forward. At Apex, the countervailing pressure is operational, integrating clients, providing reassurance, and ensuring we did not inherit their problems. That is the dull, essential work of stewardship. We created transition roadmaps, scheduled check-ins, and assigned a small number of senior client handlers to be the single point of accountability. It sounds boring because it is. Boring is valuable. I spent afternoons drafting emails, vetting communication plans, and sitting with clients who still sounded uncertain. Some asked bluntly whether I had done anything improper. I answered honestly, I had not. I had acted within legal and ethical boundaries, signaling confidently to clients the structural continuity Apex would provide. Honesty in moments like that is its own strategy. You reassure by being straightforward, not by artifice. A thread of irony threaded through the weeks that followed. Preston, who thought he'd asserted control by removing a problem, found his reputation undermined not because of a dramatic reveal, but because the market had less trust in his management decisions. Richard's departure was not a scandalous unmasking. It was a slow reappraisal. Power in corporate contexts is a function of perceived competence over time. When perceptions change, the ledger of authority changes with them. I did not revel in their discomfort. That would have been cheap. Instead, I felt the strange, complicated relief of an organizer watching a community retrench toward competence. The reward was a professional one. Clients nested under someone who would serve them reliably. The cost was human. People lost jobs, reputation suffered. That reality lodged like a pebble in my shoe. A month later, regulatory inquiries arrived. Not criminal, but administrative, standard for any significant client movement after a leadership change. These were professional inconveniences. Forms, recorded statements, requests for clarifications. We complied. Compliance is an antiseptic. It keeps narratives clean. Optima's legal team issued a press release that sounded blunter now, less performative and more factual, announcing certain procedural reviews and promising a governance overhaul. PR cannot conjure trust, it can only begin to mend it. What surprised me in quieter ways were the notes from people who had been swept up in the storm. A former mid-level analyst wrote that she had been put on temporary contract and feared she'd be let go. A project manager emailed to ask if I might recommend a recruiter. These messages tugged harder than I expected. I arranged walks, coffee meetings, and warm introductions. I could not fix the broader damage, but I could offer lines of continuity for individuals. Sometimes the small acts feel more ethically freighted than the headline moves. Making sure Chloe had a mentor team at Apex felt like a moral imperative. Getting Mara a written recommendation that highlighted her institutional knowledge, not just technical skill, felt like a moral rectifying. I did what I could to stabilize people whose lives had been dragged into the maelstrom. Weeks later, after the initial shock and the board's public recalibration, Optima announced a governance overhaul. They named an external advisor and promised structural changes. In time, some employees found their way back to steady work. Some clients returned, though not all. The firm survived. Corporations are resilient by design, but with a different composition and likely a diminished runway unless they rebuilt trust demonstrably. For me, the aftermath was tempered by a new routine. Mornings began at Apex with a different rhythm: client check-ins, team huddles, and the slow, patient building of operational confidence. I took no pleasure in noting Preston's absence from industry panels. I felt pangs for Richard for his genuine past contributions, even as I credited the changes that needed to be made. I had been labeled problematic as an insult intended to cover an insecurity. In the end, it became the word that named my refusal to be a passive steward of mediocrity. People often ask, later, whether I felt guilty. There is no theatrical confession to offer.
I felt the weight of consequence and the obligation to mitigate harm where I could. I felt satisfaction that competence had been reestablished and the practical pride of a job done well. I also felt the moral ache of the people whose careers were disrupted. Those feelings can coexist. Complexity is not a moral loophole, it's the shape of most real decisions. There was a moment, months afterward, when Arthur called me. We met not in a private club, but in his club's library, a quieter room where the light fell like a gentle oversight. He did not seek accolades. He asked about one of the junior analysts who had moved with us, whether she was getting the mentorship she needed. He asked how we were treating staff who'd come across the aisle. He wanted reassurance not about returns, but about stewardship. Money, he said, more as a proposition than a question, is easy to count. Trust is harder. How are you keeping people? I told him what we were doing. Structured onboarding, named contacts, a small commitment to internal mobility so people could see a path forward. He nodded. You were problematic, he said, almost fondly. That's a convenient word for discomfort. It's not a sin, it's a trait. It can be reform or ruin. You chose reform. I smiled. It felt like an assessment that had nothing to do with the market and everything to do with the human calculus of risk-takers and caretakers. He added, as if to punctuate a lesson, don't forget the people in the margins. They matter more than we like to admit. I carried that line with me. It changed the way I thought about leadership roles. Influence without care is a hollow instrument.
Grit without empathy is cynical. Winning under sanctioned rules doesn't absolve you from the obligation to repair. The legal threats eventually receded. Publicly, they remained a footnote, a letter here, a statement there. But without evidence of malfeasance, without the kind of concrete breach that can stick in a court of law, the narrative corrected. Optima retooled. They invested in compliance and process. Some employees rebuilt careers elsewhere. Some stayed. Months later, I stood by my window in the Apex office and watched a sunset that made the city look like a stitched canvas. For a long time, I had measured my mornings by the volume of hard problems to solve. Now I could see a path for influence that included more than transactional moves. The work still required steel and nerve. It also required a willingness to check power with tenderness. The label problematic had been flung like a weapon and returned as an emblem. In a world where corporate inertia often masquerades as wisdom, being problematic is sometimes the refusal to accept bad answers. That is a double-edged thing. It breeds enemies, certainly, and sometimes it makes you a target, but it also forces conversations that otherwise would not be had, and in industries where trust is currency, that can be salvific. The final irony, if you want one, is that the company that fired me cleaned its house not by firing me, but by exposing weaknesses it could not otherwise reconcile. They had intended to remove a liability to preserve cohesion. They instead revealed a governance problem that required a public fix. I did not set out to ruin anyone. I set out to preserve stability for clients and protect the people who trusted me. The rest was consequence. People asked if I regretted the collateral damage. I still think about Chloe and Mara and the friends who were jolted by the event. I called them often enough to learn the texture of their days. I sent referrals, recommended them for positions, and in a few cases arranged for short-term bridge payments from Apex's hiring fund to make transitions less brutal. These small acts of repair were not PR. They were an ethics practice, small, tangible, and human. At the end of the day, the market is ruthless, but it is also rational. It rewards clear custody of relationships and penalizes opaque governance. Investors move where trust appears steady. I had simply been the axis around which trust migrated. Labeled problematic, I had become a more honest steward. You can fire the employee. You can revoke a badge. You can erase access. You cannot, however, erase the years of relationship capital someone built, nor the truth that competence often lives outside the polite company of nepotism. That truth, once made visible, becomes contagious. It asks for remedial action. I sit now in my new office. A tidy desk, a small plant someone gifted me on my first day, and a window that faces a city that keeps doing what cities do, moving forward without waiting for anyone's permission. I have a team that is honest, and a list of responsibilities that matter. I check my email, call clients, and sometimes, late at night, answer messages from people who want advice on navigating corporate turbulence. The label problematic feels less like an epithet and more like a warning the world once gave me. You are inconvenient because you make people face uncomfortable truths. That's not a judgment I would choose for someone I love,
but it is a valuable category in an ecosystem that sometimes prefers comfort over competence. If there's a single thing I would pass along to someone who finds themselves suddenly unmoored by a dismissal or an organizational power play, it's this: measure your options in terms of relationships, not documents. Preserve the dignity of people swept into transitions. Play within legal and ethical lines. Signal stability to whoever matters. In the end, markets reward the sturdy shore. I am not proud of every ripple this created. Pride would be the wrong sentiment. I am satisfied that I acted in a way that preserved client interests and offered a path for affected employees. I am wary of triumphalism. I am human, and humans are messy. But the story has a tidy lesson. Competence can be inconvenient, and sometimes being inconvenient is the work of repair. If this story resonated with you, if you like the behind-the-scenes of corporate drama told with harsh coffee and cold takes, subscribe and tell us who we should examine next in the comments. I'll read them. I'll probably be labeled problematic again, and if I am, I'll answer the phone.